So in the opening verses of this week's Parsha, Ki Tavo, we're reading as Moses is instructing the Israelites on how they will bring offerings once they've officially entered the land of Israel. And Moses is explaining to the people that they are to take the first fruits of their harvest, and they'll place them in a basket, and they'll bring this basket to the high priest. And after they've made the offering, they recite the following words: Arami Oved Avi. My father went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there. But there he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to Adonai, the God of our ancestors, and Adonai heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. God freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm and awesome power, and by signs and portents, bringing us to this place and giving us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soul which you, God, have given me. So these words might sound familiar because they're not only at the beginning of our Parsha, but they serve an important role every year at the Passover Seder. Instead of retelling the whole story when we get to the Magid section, the section where we tell the story, we don't go back to the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, and tell quite an extensive story. We read these words instead. And there's an interesting discussion to be had as to why we read these words from Devarim, which are a much shorter summary than the longer story of Exodus in the book of Exodus on a night that we're remembering the story of the Exodus. But I'll save that discussion for another night because I'm hung up on a different question. You might have noticed when I read the verse out loud, the first three words I read in Hebrew. And it's because I'm still trying to figure out what they mean. Arami Oved Avi. Even as we read them every Passover, and I've studied them in rabbinical school, and I actually studied them with a group of Nefesh folks at our Parsha class this week, it's still unclear. Here are just a few ways, and I'm not exaggerating, it's just a few of the ways that it's been translated. My father was a wandering Aramaean. My father was a fugitive Aramaean. An Aramaean sought to destroy my father. An Aramaean would have destroyed my father. My ancestor was a homeless Aramaean. Verses like this are rich with possibilities, and they're verses that our sages describe to us as ones that are literally shouting out to us, Darshani, interpret me. Please make it make sense. So for the sake of tonight's discussion, I'm going to narrow it down to a couple of options. And we're going to look at two of our greatest biblical commentators. We've got Rashi and Ibn Ezra. So for Rashi, the verse means, an Aramaean sought to destroy my father. So you'll notice in this iteration, the Aramaean and the father are different people. So who are those people? Let's figure that out. So he believes that the Aramaean here is Laban, and it's that Laban sought to destroy the whole nation when he pursued Jacob. Okay, some questions. Who's Laban? I'll try to clarify here. So Laban was Abraham's great-nephew, was Isaac's cousin and brother-in-law, and was Jacob's uncle and father-in-law. And if that's hard to track, we'll just stick with Jacob. He's both Jacob's uncle and father-in-law. And so we know from Jacob's narrative that when Jacob is looking to marry, he meets Rachel and is excited to marry Rachel. Laban is Rachel's father, and essentially, this is why we actually refer to him as very deceitful. He pulls a trick on Jacob, pulls a switcheroo, and on the wedding day, he veils Leah, Rachel's sister, because in his mind, Leah was supposed to be married first because she was older. So then Jacob has to hang around even longer to then marry Rachel. again, we can have a whole nother conversation about what's going on here, but this is the Laban, the Aramean, who sought to destroy our father, my father, Jacob. But then the question is what is the destroying that he's doing? Because ultimately, Jacob does end up leaving. He's just worried that Laban is going to do harm to him. So what Rashi explains is just the intent that Laban had to maybe keep Jacob from going home, that was enough to be considered the act of destroying, okay? So the background is helpful, but all we need to know is the verse means Laban sought to destroy my father because he had this evil intention, all right? So Ibn Ezra likes very little of this. He is much more of a literalist. He's interested in learning the text and trying to uncover its most literal meaning. Its pshat is what we call it. So if Rashi's interpretation is in the spirit of darshani, a drash, interpret me, Ibn Ezra's like, but that's not what the words mean, okay? He goes into a whole explanation that, and grammar nerds, here we go, that the verb oved here is an intransitive verb, okay? So it's in this grammatical form, it can't mean to destroy. It has to mean something else. If it meant destroy, we'd be reading the words mavid or me'abed, the same shoresh, the same three letters. And so for Ibn Ezra, it has to mean my father was a wandering Aramean. So in this case, Jacob is both the father and the Aramean. All right, so let's review. Rashi says we've got an Aramean destroying my father, Laban destroying Jacob. Ibn Ezra saying Jacob is the Aramean who is our father and he was wandering. All right, now we're up to speed. So who's right? Who's right is now what I'm interested in. Who's right and how do we decide who's right? And honestly, how does the answer that we land on impact our theology of the Passover story, our theology of our Torah reading, our theology generally? Because there are very serious implications, because these are the opening words to the story of Passover, which, yes, the book of Breshit has a lot of other lovely things going for it, but for the most part, we think of the Torah as the 5 books of Moses, the 5 books of this story. And they have very different potential repercussions depending on how we translate these 3 words. So Rabbi David Kasher, dear friend of this community, David's first cousin, he writes that what is interesting about these 2 interpretations is that in one, the Aramean is himself the wanderer, the early immigrant who first settles the land, and in the other, the Aramean is this powerful landowner who holds the fate of the immigrant in his hands. It's a simple change of generations and circumstances that has placed the once vulnerable party into the role of the oppressor. He's then going to bring in a teaching, a much more contemporary teaching from an 18th century commentator, Moses Mendelssohn. And Mendelssohn is reminding us that in his mind, the very purpose of this verse is to make space for all of it, all of the translations, the interpretations of Ibn Ezra and Rashi and Rashbam and Abarbanel and all the folks I didn't bring in, because the idea being that this verse is meant to contain multitudes. The Aramean is Jacob. The Aramean is Laban. The Aramean is Abraham. The Aramean is all of our forefathers, all of our foremothers, all of our ancestors. What the verse is doing is it's making space for multiple theologies, but even more so, it's making space for the multitudes within ourselves. If we understand that we are the descendants of the Arameans, then we aren't just one iteration of this verse. We have at various points been each of these figures. This Aramean is something that we understand. We've been all of these roles at various points in our lives. And so what it has me thinking about, and what I want to pose to all of us tonight, is over this past year, or years, or weeks, whatever is the time period that currently feels manageable to chew on, in what ways have you been the vulnerable wanderer? And in what ways have you been unforgiving and unreasonable and unrelenting, like this oppressor? And furthermore, have there been moments where it's possible that you've been both at the very same time? So these next couple of weeks are, at least for this year, our last opportunities to do the meaningful but very challenging work that is this process of teshuvah. Teshuvah being, again, so many ways to understand it. Is it repentance? Is it return? Is it reconciliation? Is it repair? Whatever it is, I know it's not black and white. And we learn in our laws of repentance in the Mishnah Torah that it is forbidden for a person to be cruel and to not make amends. Instead, a person should get appeased easily and get angry slowly. I'm going to say that again because it feels in some ways like, oh, what a beautiful teaching, and then you're like, that sounds impossible. We should get appeased easily, and we should get angry slowly. Wow, if only it was that simple. Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg is explaining that sometimes we might resist owning our less optimal choices because we feel guilty or we feel ashamed. We might resist because we don't want to face the inevitable consequences of coming clean. Maybe sometimes, or honestly a lot of the time, we resist owning the harm we've perpetrated because it would require us to face the ways in which we are different than our heroic self-conception. Facing how we haven't been our best selves is agonizing, and it's painful, and it might require rewriting our entire internal narrative. We are as fallible and as flawed as everyone else. We also have repentance work to do. So in a couple moments, I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to give us some time to think about these questions with one another. Turn to someone you're close to. And as we're thinking about this Aramaean and the ways that Rabbi Kasher helps us understand that we so easily can weave in and out of being the wanderer and the oppressor, and sometimes we can be both at the same time, what are the moments this year that just weren't that black and white? When were you both at the same time? What are the moments that you weren't totally in the right or totally in the wrong? And as you think about what teshuvah looks like around it, maybe you both are hoping for an apology but need to deliver one for the exact same instance. If you're only viewing yourself as the oppressive Aramaean, why don't you view yourself as worthy of forgiveness? And if you're currently only identifying as the vulnerable, wandering Aramaean, what might it take for you to own up to the hurt that you've caused? So what are the next steps we can take to be an Aramaean that contains all of these multitudes on our journey towards giving and receiving teshuvah? Whichever one of those questions feels like it's landing, I'll invite you to take 5 to 8 minutes to turn to someone close to you, and let's set aside some time right now to figure out what our next steps are before the high holidays.